Australia is a huge and very beautiful country, and most of it is accessible to you and I, but some of it not in the ordinary family hack. You need something a little more special. In the years we've made Torque, we've looked at almost all of the top four-wheel drives in this country, but there are a few left that are a little bit more special. The first of these is the International Travel Top Scout. Tonight's program concerns itself entirely with four-wheel drive vehicles. This and the Jeep Renegade, which follow it, are what you might call a fair combination of both workhorse and recreational vehicle. And after that, one pure workhorse and one which remains something of an enigma. We're not going to use these vehicles in situations which might upset conservationists, which in fact we all should be. And therefore I certainly won't be driving them on beaches for a start, because beaches and sand dunes particularly are very fragile areas which ought to be protected. And in terms of trails, we will use made trails rather than going bush bashing and making our own, which once again is simply not on. Okay, the International. The interior is pretty good. It's spacious, there's lots of light, it seems to have good appointments. By the same token, it looks awfully cheap. And there's some things about it that I reckon could be improved. Bear in mind, it's made in the United States of America, where it is a relatively inexpensive four-wheel drive off-road vehicle. But out here, it gets to be around the $15,000 mark, which makes it pretty pricey. Things like this, for example, which sort of thin plastic and move around and don't seem to be attached very well, are a bit of a worry. But they are really good seats. There should be a glove compartment in the dash panel there. There's just a great big blank piece of metal which should make a nice little hole for various things you carry with you. And I have to mention something about seat belts, which brings me to a subject which worries me somewhat. Because this is a commercial vehicle, and because the commercial vehicle code at this stage does not require what you might consider to be the ultimate seat belt, that is an inertia reel lap sash system, all you get is a lap belt. Something to do with the attitudes of big companies towards little people. We deserve to be protected, and they ought to protect us with the best equipment there is available.
The first thing you notice about the Travel Top Scout is that it is big, and that in this sort of tight country you have to work a bit at manoeuvring. So it's not the sort of thing you'd buy for sport. But it handles rough country well. Amazing amounts of torque allow you just to idle over soft, rutted or bumpy surfaces, so you're not constantly working away at gears and final drive ratios. And hill climbing, even in these tortuous circumstances, is an absolute breeze. One problem arises. It takes a lot of steering to negotiate even small turns. So the engine power advantage is offset by the amount of work you do with your arms. Interior comfort is very good. Like all good four-wheel drives, it has a long travel suspension which really absorbs bump and shock. And there's plenty of that right here. The mechanicals of this vehicle really are very good. It has a big 5.6 litre V8, lots of torque, and an absolutely superb automatic transmission that I honestly can't fault.
The method of selecting your four-wheel drive high range and four-wheel drive low range is simple and fast and done on the move, even though at relatively low speeds, which is good. And as simple as this. Into neutral, straight through, back into gear.
Really, if it weren't for the steering and the shoddiness of the interior, I'd be quite impressed by this vehicle.
Well, most of the news about the International is good news, but there's a few things that are not so good. We tried to use this vehicle in very soft sand and it would have nothing of it whatsoever. That's principally a matter of changing the wheels and tyres. If it had the right big, fat, soft tyres on it, it would have probably handled the sand reasonably well, but in this condition with this equipment, no way. And there's something else at the back. This tailgate assembly is very primitive indeed, indicative of about the 1950s. This vehicle is made in the United States of America, where you would think that some sort of consumer pressure would have been effective by now, but apparently not. It really is very cheap and nasty. Have a look at this. I mean, that's not the sort of thing you'd expect in a 1970s vehicle of any kind. And, what's more, if you see what I mean, it's also very difficult to close it. That's pretty silly. In a vehicle that costs $15,000, we can expect a great deal better than that. Second in our list of four-wheel drives is the name that started it all, Jeep. And frankly, you would think with all that experience they could do a little better. I'm really surprised to find still in 1980 that people who build four-wheel drive off-road machines insist on making them so basic and so austere that they are decidedly uncomfortable, and this one would have to be just a little more uncomfortable than most. In no way could you compare it with the International, and neither should we, because one is, in fact, a family station wagon style of four-wheel drive, and the other one is more your so-called macho machine, you know, the sort of thing you go playing in the country with. But it is so off, as far as I'm concerned, in its interior appointments and comfort, that it's worth taking a look at. This vehicle is made by American Motors Corporation, as I think we've already established with the Rambler Matador some years ago. They don't even know how to get their sedans right. So it's not surprising that this one leaves a bit to be desired. In the first place, it's quite obvious that people who use vehicles like this need and deserve just as much comfort as anybody else who drives cars. And yet here we have a seat with so little adjustment that that's as far back as I can get from the steering wheel, putting me in a very cramped position. And secondly, the steering wheel is offset so that the column points over the top of my right shoulder and makes it virtually impossible for me to steer it from behind the wheel where I should be, because I'm over here like this. And thirdly, this marvellous concept of the American tilt steering wheel, which gives you 4 positions from there, 1, 2, 3 and 4 up there, only one of which is really usable, which is about there. And certainly that is usable by nobody at all, so it's a pretty useless sort of a system. The seats themselves are uncomfortable, harsh as a board, no support up above the centre of the back, made from so-called denim vinyl, again that macho image thing, but totally superficial and very impractical, and supported by this sort of thing, which is sort of bolt-on dash trim that looks ugly, is ugly, and doesn't do anything practical at all for anybody. Look, what's more, here we have this hardtop which is detachable. And in this vehicle, at least, we have a roll bar. But the roll bar is optional. Now, in no vehicle with a detachable hardtop should a roll bar be optional. It must be compulsory. Every vehicle of this type should have one. If it falls over, this thing, because it is not as strong as a structural member of the vehicle itself, is going to collapse, and it's probably going to crush your head in the process. The roll bar has also the potential for mounting the proper inertia reel lap sash belt, but we don't have those. We just have a little cheapy lap belt that does practically nothing at all, and it's all that the Americans apparently feel that they need to have. And since this again is considered to be a commercial vehicle, it's not compulsory for us to have them fitted for Australian conditions, and it ought to be. There's not very much about the interior of this Jeep Renegade that I like, but perhaps it'll work in practical purposes, so we'll go and give it a try.
The Jeep is really no different from any other four-wheel drive on made roads. But in rough going, I have to admit it does well. Plenty of power from the 4.3 litre six-cylinder engine coupled to an automatic transmission and constant four-wheel drive. It'll handle almost anything except soft sand, just like the International. And just like the International, it has a steering problem. But in this case, it's truly bad. You really build muscles on your muscles driving the thing. Not only macho image, but you'd have to be Superman to take it off-road. That's just another example of the Jeep's lack of concern for any kind of driver comfort. And for off-road sport, which is what it's all about, the Jeep, therefore, is simply not on.
By a strange irony, we decided next to test a pure workhorse and discovered immediately that sort of sense of detail that had been so lacking in the American recreational vehicles. If you've got to have a tailgate, it might as well close like that. One quick look at the Toyota Hilux four-wheel drive utility and you can see immediately that there's a great deal more thought gone into that sort of detail. And I guess that'll influence the comfort, but we'll talk about that in a moment. Right now, let's think about the four-wheel drive transmission. This is a four-speed manual transmission, which I prefer, and particularly with smaller engines, as this one certainly is, being of only 2 litres, less than half of the capacity of the American four-wheel drives. The select mechanism for the high and low ranges is also easier to get at and easier to use, and we're going to use it right now. So let's go. That's in high 2, that's high 4, that's low 4. Let's do some work. There's not really a lot of tricks in driving four-wheel drive vehicles over very rough country. It simply means taking things nice and gently and trying to select the most effective and therefore least difficult path.
If you don't do that, you might finish up being stuck in a very embarrassing situation and not able to get out of it again. It is important to have already pre-selected the right range of gears. And by that I simply mean that if you're not in four-wheel drive, and perhaps even four-wheel drive low range when you need to be, you might finish up being stuck. That's embarrassing and awkward.
The Toyota climbs hills like that one very well. It's got a stupidly located horn button, which I consistently keep hitting, particularly when I'm working hard. But there is a very high degree of roughness and discomfort from the suspension, which I suspect has something to do with suspension travel, and I'll confirm that a little later on.
After all, this country is pretty rough and it couldn't be expected to be much less than heavy going. The steering's pretty good, and certainly there is a very high degree of comfort in the cabin, which is important again in conditions like these. In a minute we'll get out of this and onto something just a little more reasonable. The jostling these things drive you mad. Well, that has to be the reason. There's very stiff springing, obviously, and very short suspension travel. That is, the springs aren't allowed to travel very far before they hit the bump stop rubbers, and then there's no suspension at all, at which point, of course, it kicks the vehicle, which it's doing all the time on these rough roads. It also has very skinny little shock absorbers, not off-road shock absorbers at all. That's something they could certainly improve. And if they do, it will probably be a very good off-road vehicle, but it's not yet.
Although the Toyota Hilux four-wheel drive could be considered to be a recreational vehicle, quite obviously its major purpose in life is as a work vehicle, and so we have to test it off tracks occasionally. In this case, that means private property, paddock, the sort of place it might be expected to do its most work. Pretty steep, pretty rough.
Once again, I have pre-selected low-range four-wheel drive, and I'm at this moment in second gear. It might not have needed low range, but the point is that it's better to have it and not want it than want it and not have it, and once again get stuck halfway.
This is steep. No problem even in second gear. Very light throttle pressure, and just let the vehicle walk up. It handles these sorts of situations easily.
The Toyota Hilux pickup will be a very good four-wheel drive vehicle when they revise the suspension. We could make an interesting hybrid here. If we took the suspension from either the International or from the Jeep and we slung it up underneath the Toyota, it would be great. Perhaps it needs a touch more power, but in every other respect, it really is a very good vehicle. And now for the Enigma. Why enigmatic, you may well say, and I would simply have to answer by suggesting that a car that is built for the dual purpose of normal family motoring and off-road seems to be a bit of a conundrum. There is a definite paradox there. Very difficult to make something that does both jobs very well. This is the second of the Subaru four-wheel drive off-road family station wagons. The first one I thought was pretty ordinary and left a great deal to be desired. But this one has been substantially modified and updated, and some things I'll describe to you in just a few moments that are new and decidedly different from any other Subaru of its style. I can begin by telling you it is very noisy on this sort of rough surface, which I find annoying, but at the same time, while I can hear the suspension crashing, I can't feel it. It's quite comfortable, so it's well insulated so far as feel is concerned, even if not against noise. A nice little innovative feature in this vehicle is that you can raise or lower the body on the suspension to give you improved ground clearance for really off-road difficult conditions. Now, a not so nice feature of that is that you've got to climb in here to do it, meaning that you've got to take everything out of the back seat. It's an awkward position. It's very difficult to get at, and as a result, difficult to turn. But nevertheless, it can be done. This, as it happens, is the adjustment just for the rear suspension. Just before we go to the front, this is a standard station wagon configuration, but with one small problem. Nicely balanced tailgate, closes and opens very easily, but it's sloped here. And when you put a lot of things in the boot, particularly luggage, suitcases, you find it very hard to close the boot, and it might have been more effective if it had been a little squarer. Maybe not aesthetically pleasing, but more effective. The front adjustment, as it happens, is not much easier. It's up under here, and there are two nuts which again help to raise the car on its suspension. A little difficult to get at in both cases, and I would suggest if you're going off-road seriously that you do all this preparation before you leave. It's a bit of embarrassment to unload everybody and spend half an hour doing it once you actually get out there. I mentioned that the vehicle is noisy. One of the reasons that it is because the glass in the windows don't have any frames. It's not unusual practice in sports cars, but it's pretty unusual in off-road vehicles, as a result of which, whether they're up or whether they're down, they rattle about inside this door area, and they don't seal very well, so there's some dust comes in as well. Not good for an off-road vehicle of any kind. This vehicle is known as the Subaru Leone, and there are two versions of it for four-wheel drive operation, one with and one without low range. My main criticism of the earlier model was that because it didn't have low range, it was very limited in its capacity to go very far off-road. You had to slip the clutch all the time to keep the vehicle moving. So, low range is a good idea. But as it happens,
I still don't think it's low enough, and it's still necessary to slip the clutch occasionally. But it's certainly an improvement, and a second improvement is that the engine size has been increased from 1.6 to 1.8 litres, and therefore you've got more power. Another failing in the old model. So the low-range version of the Leone has some capacity for doing things reasonably well, but still some obvious limitations.
Its capacity, of course, must be limited, but then you would understand that when you bought it. It couldn't possibly do all of the things that a real four-wheel drive machine could do. That's where I believe it's somewhat enigmatic. I really don't quite see what the purpose is. Once you get back on the bitumen, it's not much quieter, unfortunately. There is a fantastic amount of transmission of noise from the road through this car. At least there isn't the thumping and crashing that you get on the dirt road, but unless, of course, you hit a bump, which will immediately, like that on the edge of the road, for example, send that same noise crashing. It's a very harsh feeling motor car. Now, even as far as the engine is concerned, a four-cylinder horizontally opposed engine which gives good power for sure, reasonable torque characteristics, but it has a harsh feel about it.
The whole car reflects this sort of harshness. A lack of refinement, I suppose, is what you'd have to call it, which comes as a result of this need to compromise a true road-going sedan with the strength and the rigidity and the torsional stiffness of an off-road vehicle. For my money, it just doesn't work.
I'm really quite surprised at this second round of four-wheel drive vehicles we've looked at. I'm not entirely happy with any of them. The Americans have made great mechanicals, but a very poor attempt at quality and finish. The Japanese have come up with a mixture of reasonable mechanicals, but very good interiors, and some very strange handling. Now, the indications I get is that what we've got here is a stack of independent designers rushing around full of their own particular ideas about what we should have, none of them quite prepared to take a look at somebody else's product. I have to repeat, a hybrid somewhere along the line would be terrific. With the possible exception of the Subaru, and I simply do not believe that a true compromise of this sort can really ever work satisfactorily. I can't see there being too much of a life for a vehicle like this. Good night. See you next week.
Stay viewing now for the final episode of that fine drama series, A Family Affair. And make sure you join us tomorrow night at 7:30 for another epic look at life on Earth. This week, David Attenborough will be giving his attention to one of the most powerful forces of evolution, the duel between the hunter and the hunted. Life on Earth, tomorrow night at 7:30.